Benitirit. Today I want to talk about something that I titled a bit provocatively, to be honest, a bit clickbaitly, mindful coding. And what do I mean by that? Is coding with intent, with intention, right? And this is not about like feeling your breath as you're coding or, you know, feeling every muscle in your fingers. What I mean is more about expressing the intent in your code. And for some people, this may seem obvious. Like, of course, if I want to iterate over a list, I express it with a for loop, right? But the thing is that the iteration is the action. What are you doing with that iteration, right? Why are you iterating over the list? And I think that's what's important, and that's what's underrated in a way. That's what's overlooked many times. It's explaining why you're doing things. And if you go to the most basic elements of programming, that's what variables are, that's what function names are. I mean, that's why we give names to things, right? Otherwise, we would just have primitives and anonymous functions all over the place. Why do we give names to things? To express intent, right? Not only to express what they are, because you don't name a constant 5, for example, right? You name it maximum retries, right? Or something meaningful. And and that explains why that value exists, what is the purpose of that value. And I think that that's important because I mean it seems very obvious at the variable level, but many times we have trouble naming things. And I'm sure you heard the joke of, the two most difficult things in computer science are naming things, caching validation, and off by one errors. Um, but it's true that it's difficult because sometimes we end up building certain pieces of software that don't really have a purpose besides being like an auxiliary function, right? Or besides just serving a purpose for the code itself. And many times helps once you're having trouble finding a name to take a step back and to wonder, why am I having trouble finding a name, right? Recently I had actually this discussion with a colleague in which he suggested to extract certain pieces of code into a function, right? To make it shorter, I think. I don't remember exactly the reasoning behind it. But we were having trouble finding a name. And, what I told them is I think that the reason why we don't have a name for this is because this cut is completely arbitrary. We are not separating a concern from another. We're not encapsulating. We are not abstracting, a piece of logic that can be reused. We're simply drawing a completely arbitrary line here, uh, and for no good reason, and that actually gets reflected in the difficulty naming that, right? Or the other tell of something being abstracted at the wrong level is when you find the need to say and, you know validate and store. Those are two different things. Yeah, validate and reject, for example. If it validates and also returns an HTTP error or raises an HTTP exception, that shouldn't be there, right? That's not the right abstraction. And that's what I think it's so important, so valuable about names is, not only because they explain what something is, but they can also point at something, not being the correct abstraction of something, not doing too many things. One more example. commit messages. Um, it's very common to see commit messages that explain what the code does. But if I want to know what it does, I just look at the code in the commit. I don't need the commit message to tell me, I don't know, we introduced this module. I look at the code and I see that the module, is being created and introduced there. So why write it there, right? Instead, what is useful in a commit message is to explain why. Why are we introducing this module? This, I think, is what gives then the repository this idea of history, right? In which it explains what the history of the code is, and not in the sense of we change line 13, right? That's not meaningful. What's meaningful is to understand uh, we're making this change because we realize that in this other way it doesn't work how we were doing it before. We found this bug, we have found this problem, users complained, and now we're changing it because of this. And that's the intention behind the code. With comments, for example, you know, a comment that tells me assigning 5 to the variable x tells me nothing because I can see that in the line of code, right? Explain why are we assigning that number, or don't explain anything. Sometimes, that can be also too much. Explain at a higher level, explain at something that is very convoluted, or to understand it properly, you would need more context than when you see in the code, right? And then it will make sense. Like, for example, as I mentioned earlier, we found this bug in this particular case. That's why we have to do this thing that I know, don't optimize it. We tried already. We know someone will come and try to optimize it and find it the same, run into the same error, right? Um, so keep in mind when you're writing comments, when you're writing commit messages, uh, the importance of explaining why. Because what the code already tells you. Thank you for watching.